Welcome to the Miss Ileane Speaks podcast. I'm so glad you joined me because we're going to have so much fun talking about blogging, social media, YouTube, and how you can make meaningful content for your audience. The show notes for this podcast can be found at ILEANESBUDDY.com. So let's get started. Hey everyone, Ileane Smith here, and in today's episode, we're going to cover the top 5 myths about hosting your podcast with Anchor. So hold on to your earbuds, everybody. This is going to be a fun ride. In July of 2018, I had the privilege and the opportunity to attend Podcast Movement. Podcast Movement is the biggest conference that's focused on podcasters. It is an amazing, incredible event. I met so many awesome people there. I connected with so many folks that I've been following online. I've listened to their podcasts, or they've listened to mine, and I also got introduced to a lot of great people at Podcast Movement. I'm so glad they decided to come to Philadelphia this year. So with that said, one of the things that I was able to do was to attend the session from Mike Mignano, who is the CEO and co-founder of Anchor. And in that session, he gave a lot of insights. And as you can imagine, some of the other competitors, or shall I say paid podcast hosts, were in attendance. And these are guys that I know and respect and have been my podcasting mentors for years. They were in attendance, but somehow some of the feedback that came back from Mike's presentation was, as you can imagine, not too kind. Now, I sat up in the front row. I went up, introduced myself to Michael. We took ussies together. I also met a few of the other folks on the Anchor team, and they were very, very nice. And they also thanked me. I just love the fact that Michael thanked me for doing the Anchor show, and he actually said that it's podcasters like you that help us be who we are. And I love the fact that Anchor is shaking up the podcasting industry. It's giving people an easy way to start a podcast. So with that said, like I said, no disrespect to some of the other podcasting hosts. You guys, if you've been around me for a while, you know I've used them all, and I'm currently using some of them. I still think that they should have been more open. They should have been more willing to have a dialogue. Of course, they're not going to tell all their customers, yeah, this Anchor thing is a good idea. But at the same time, to think about what can they learn from what Anchor is doing so that they can integrate into their platforms and perhaps provide their customers with better customer support. And I want to give a big shout out to the guys from Podcast Movement for actually giving Anchor the opportunity to speak. And so that's Jared Easley, Dan Franks, and Gary Leland. Shout out to you guys because, podcasting is wide open right now. And I think it's wonderful that you are giving people different opportunities, such as the podcasting track that Elsie Escobar was the lead on, and it was talking about advocacy and making sure that all the underrepresented audiences and people who don't have access to podcasting, how can we get them access to become podcasters? And I think that Anchor has done an amazing job at that because of the fact that their hosting is free. So with that, there were some takeaways and some myths about Anchor that I heard as a reflection of this podcast movement talk. And some of it, quite frankly, I've been hearing for quite some time. So I want to dispel some of those myths. So without further ado, let's start with number 1. Anchor does a fantastic job of distributing your podcast to different directories. However, myth number 1 is that Anchor auto submits podcasters to Apple Podcasts. Anchor does not do that. And those of you who are listening who are on the Anchor app, you know that we have the option, the very first option of submitting our podcast. We have to manually tell Anchor to submit our podcast to Apple Podcasts on our behalf. And even going forward, after your podcast is in Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and all the other places, on the per episode level, you have a choice of saying that I want this episode published in Anchor only, or I want it distributed. Now, once you've told Anchor that you want your podcast distributed on Apple Podcasts, they will automatically submit to Google Podcasts and Spotify. I say Spotify because that's something that no other podcast host is doing currently. They are not auto submitting your podcast to Spotify, contrary to what they may want you to believe. And then also there is Castbox and Overcast. Now, some of these podcast apps are actually pulling from the Apple directory, but they are also being submitted by Anchor. It just all depends upon the podcasting app, like Breaker, for example, where they may be pulling from the Apple directory. However, there are some cases where Anchor is actually submitting your show. For example, from myself, I wanted to also be listed in Stitcher. And so I'd send them an email. I was actually corresponding with Anchor support about something else. And then I said, well, what about Stitcher? And they said, okay, nope, you're in Stitcher now as well. So Anchor makes it very easy for your podcast to be distributed in other podcast directories, especially Spotify, which is the sticking point in my head. In my opinion, it's a sticking point that the other hosts don't do for you automatically. And, but there is no auto submission of podcasts to Apple Podcasts. So that's number 1. But it also is going to segue over into my number 2 myth. And this actually came to me as a question during a Facebook live stream. So this was just a question from someone who follows me. They watch my YouTube videos. They have liked my Facebook page, and they're asking questions about Anchor and about podcasting in general. And the question came up about, will Anchor upload your audio files to Apple Podcasts? And I'm going to put that down as myth number 2, because even though this myth is not specific to Anchor, it is a specific myth that people need to know about podcasting. Apple does not host your files. This is why you need a podcast host. Okay. Apple is nothing like YouTube. Like YouTube gives you unlimited storage. You can just upload files all day long to YouTube and they never charge you a dime. You cannot upload files to Apple Podcasts. It just doesn't work that way. It works off of your RSS feed. And I've got plenty of episodes here that talk about RSS feeds and the importance of your RSS feed. But that is how you get submitted into the Apple Podcast directory. Through your RSS, you never upload a file to Apple Podcasts. Now we're moving on to our number 3 myth, and it has to do with stats. And guys, I gotta tell you, before we even start talking about stats, I want to give you a little bit of the history of my own stats. Well, one of the podcasting hosts that I use besides Anchor is Libsyn. And Libsyn has always been known as the number 1 podcasting host, the longest and one of the largest podcasting hosts. So I listen to their podcast called The Feed, which is hosted by Elsie Escobar. Yes, I said her name again. Love her to pieces. And Rob Walsh. And I'd met both of these guys before, and we had a little bit of a Libsyn meetup during Podcast Movement. And we had a nice time. So now let's get to the stats. The reason why I mentioned The Feed is because every 2 weeks, they have an episode, and Rob takes a segment of the show and talks about Libsyn stats. And boy, oh boy, you got to be super geeky to follow along with what he talks about there, because he goes into what's called the mean and the median number, how the stats are calculated, how the different user agents that people use to consume podcasts, and how that's all factored in. And if you're a stats geek, you definitely need to listen to Rob go through the Libsyn stats. Now, with all of that said, one of the things that he does is he lets folks know that if they've got a certain number of listens, 45 days after they've released an episode, then he would say that you are in the top half of podcasters versus you're not in the top half, or you're in the top 5%, or you're in the top 1%. He really breaks it down. And like I said, if you're a stats geek, you'll love it. Personally, I'm not that much of a stats geek. I kind of like looking at trends to say, okay, this episode has been listened to the most, because I know that my audience has a finite size. I know that the type of show that I do, my podcast, and I've got 3 of them, there's only going to be a certain amount of people that want to listen to the show, no matter what. Okay? It's not a comedy podcast. I'm not talking about current affairs. I'm not talking about news. So it's not a general interest. And it's not even a business podcast, because I talk about tech. I talk about, for example, this podcast, The Anchor Show. I'm talking about Anchor. So who really cares about Anchor except someone who's on Anchor or thinking about using Anchor? And then there's about 10 people out there that just love me and they'll listen to me no matter what I say. Shout out to y'all. Hey, Tish. Love you, boo. All right. So now let's get into our myth number 3 about Anchor. Now, this myth is not just about Anchor, but it's about stats. Because Anchor submits your podcast to Apple Podcast, they have the direct tie-in with your stats. Now, Anchor has given us a little bit of a stats dashboard on our website. And I actually asked Michael about this in the Q&A of his session at Podcast Movement. I asked about the stats, and I thought that the stats are not that great. And guess what? Michael said he doesn't think they're all that great either. And so he knows that the stats that we get from Anchor need work. So here's the myth. Anchor is taking the information that they're getting from Apple Podcasts and integrating it with what they think is the way that they should count your downloads or your listens or whatever. May not be the industry standard, but that's basically how they're doing it. Now, all of the other paid podcast hosts say, oh my God, this is horrible, because you can't log into Apple Podcast Connect and see your stats because Anchor has submitted your show and Anchor owns that podcast. And Apple Podcast Connect. Well, here's the myth. As I mentioned, I have a show on Libsyn, and I can log into Apple Podcast Connect. And guess what? I don't have any stats. I don't have any stats over there. Apple tells me it's not enough data. So my show's not big enough to show up on their radar, which to me doesn't make sense. I mean, YouTube could tell me if I only have 2 views. So even if I only have 2 listens on my podcast in Apple, why can't Apple tell me that? So Apple is the one that doesn't give you all of your stats. Now, if you have a larger show, for example, my daughter, I can't talk about podcasting without talking about my daughter, right? Nicole, she has the Better Than Success podcast, and she does quite well, even by Rob Walsh's standards of, who's in the top and who's the median and the mean and all that good stuff. So Nicole has a dedicated listenership to her podcast. And yes, when you log in to her Podcast Connect, or when I log in, sorry, you can't. You can see stats. You can see where people start listening, where people stop listening. Or of course, they stop listening when she starts talking about, leave me a rating and review or whatever. I actually haven't logged in there in a while, but I did do a behind the scenes in a YouTube video where I went through the stats in Libsyn. I looked at the stats in Anchor. I looked at the stats in my daughter's Podcast Connect. I took some screenshots to make sure I hid any sensitive information. Okay. So if you want to see what those stats dashboards look like on a larger podcast, then you want to head over to my YouTube video. But the myth is that just because you host with a paid host, you're going to be able to log in and see your stats. Because I'm here to tell you, I've been using Libsyn since 2014 or maybe 13. And I don't have any stats in Podcast Connect. Now, that's not Libsyn's fault. That is Apple's fault. So there you have it. There is myth number 3. Okay, guys, thanks for hanging in there with me because we are now talking about myth number 4. And before we move into that, I just want to remind you that you can support this show with listener support. Just go to ILEANE.link/support. That's ILEANE.link/support. And wherever you're listening to this show, you can add your support. 99 cents a month, $4.99 a month, or $9.99 a month. And so that's going to bring us to Anchor not being focused on the listener side of things. I thought this was a fascinating conclusion. I mentioned during Anchor's presentation at Podcast Movement that I was hanging off of every word Michael Mignano said. I sat in the front seat on the front row. I would have sat on his lap if I could have, although I probably would have broke his back if I did that. But I listened to every single word, contrary to some other podcasting advocates and hosts who sat way in the back of the room. And somehow, between the front of the room and the back of the room, Michael said something that made it seem like they're not focused on the listeners. And that's nothing. Oh, let me say this a different way. Nothing could be further from the truth. I've been using Anchor for over a year, and they are super focused on the listener. They're more focused on the listener than any of the other hosts that I use and pay for. So when we're talking about stats and we're talking about a comparison, and remember I said Michael admitted that they needed to work on their stats and they also want to get stats into the app. When I look at my stats for the Anchor show, of course, most of my listens are coming from within the app. And see, this is what some of the others don't understand because they don't use Anchor, is that there is a built-in listener base inside the app. Doesn't have to come from Apple Podcasts, and it doesn't have to come from Google Podcasts. You know, listeners has always been a goal. That's the unique thing about Anchor, because it's a host and it's a listening app. It's not really a directory, although you can import your RSS feed if you want to move from another host. It's not really a directory. It is a listening app where there is a community of people that listen to one another's podcast. You never have to leave Anchor. If you are a podcast listener, there is a podcast listener for every taste and every topic right inside of the app. And so you often hear a statistic being thrown around that, oh, a lot of the shows have pod faded. That's because they're listeners. They've signed up for Anchor, and maybe they put out an episode or two and they realized that, hey, it wasn't that great and maybe podcasting's not for them, but they still enjoy listening. They still enjoy listening. I have to say that again because I don't know how anyone construed anything that Michael said to mean they're not focused on listeners. Now, what they could have misunderstood was the fact that they were talking about, or that Michael was talking about, you don't always have to grow a huge audience. Your podcast can be very niche. It can be very small. And that's okay. And honey, let me tell you, I breathed a sigh of relief when I heard him say that. It was like a breath of fresh air for me because I'm so sick of hearing all these podcasters and YouTubers as well. I'm not going to just say podcasters, but you got to grow your show, how to have a bigger audience, how to make sure that you get more listeners. And the way to get more listeners is word of mouth. And it's like, it drives me nuts. Why can't your podcast be for a small audience? It could be a small audience of listeners inside of the Anchor app. I know a lot of podcasters over on Anchor that they know that no one else is listening to their show other than folks on Anchor. And what's wrong with that? So there's a myth that I want to dispel, get out of your head right now. Anchor is focused on listeners. They're focused on making it easy for people to start a podcast, but they've also given a really cool app. They've provided a really cool app to help us listen and consume content. And quite frankly, I love it. As now, I want to talk about the monetization really quickly because this always ties in why podcasters and most of the podcasting industry is always talking about growing your show and getting more listeners. And it all has to do with advertising. Advertisers aren't going to look at your show if you don't have 5,000 downloads. Okay. This is the reason why I started listening to podcasts instead of the radio anyway, because I don't want to hear advertising. There are all kinds of ways that you can make money from your show that have nothing to do with advertising. And of course, listener support is one of those, but we'll get into it in another episode. I'm going to give you guys some other ways that you can monetize your podcast. So you don't have to worry about advertising. You don't have to worry about growing huge numbers. What you want is loyal and dedicated listeners. That's much more important. It's a case of quality versus quantity. The final myth that we're going to cover in today's episode, myth number 5, is about Anchor's TOS. TOS is the terms of service. You know, when you sign up for Anchor, you agree to their terms of service. I mean, that's the way it is for any app. You click that little box. Nobody ever goes over and reads these long, boring legalese terms of service. However, it's so amusing to me that some of the other podcast hosts have decided to read out Anchor's terms of service and point to all these negative things in their terms. Because remember, Anchor is unique. It's a little different than other podcasting hosts because it's also an app that lets you create your podcast. There's also a social aspect to Anchor. We still have some social things in there where we can give people applause and we can give them messages, call into their show. And we can also view the listeners of our episodes. You know, this is some interesting, innovative and revolutionary podcasting tools that we have here on Anchor. So I can understand why some of the other podcasting hosts would like to point to the negative parts of the terms of service. But personally, I've got this question myself in the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Does Anchor own your content? Now, I'm not going to read all the boring parts of the Anchor terms of service. I'm going to read the part that I like because, hey, it's my show. And I get to read the part that I want instead of reading all those negative parts that the other podcast hosts like to read. So here we go. License grant. You retain all of your ownership rights in your user content. That's it. End quote. You retain your rights. I think that the myth gets really amplified because Anchor has this ability for us to, like I mentioned, the messages or what we used to call call-ins on Anchor version 2. It's the same thing. It's just called messages now. So you leave me a message, I have the right to play it on my podcast. So there's different sentences and statements within the terms of service that point to that usage. There's also something called derivative works. And the derivative works, as Mike Mignano explained when he was on stage at Podcast Movement, have to do with the fact that we can take a 2-minute segment and Anchor will transcribe that and turn it into a video. That's the derivative work that they're referring to. Honestly, nobody's going to go and download all of your podcasts and then publish it as their own podcast. Now, don't get me wrong. People have tried to do that. People have done that to me with my courses that I've had on Udemy and my YouTube videos. They take them down and they upload them. You know, of course, Anchor's not facilitating that. You know, can you imagine how many people would have taken down Gary V's podcast and uploaded it on their own and said, no, Anchor gave me the license to do it. Come on, guys. Let's be real. You know, let's go back to this conversation about advertising because this is really important. And I want you to pay attention to this. Everybody has been talking a lot about Spotify. I even had an episode here where I talked about how easy Anchor makes it for us to get onto Spotify. Think about it. Spotify started integrating podcasting into their app because they want to run ads against your content. Believe it or not, my good friends at Google, Google have the Google Podcast. Don't think that they don't want to run ads against your content. So you have this ad-free platform, and they have these terms of service that are being misconstrued to be something that's taking your content so they can do whatever they want to with it. Yet everybody's encouraging us to get on Spotify and to get on Google Podcasts. And guess what? They're going to do what they want to do with it. They're going to monetize your content. Okay? So clearly this is not something that Anchor is trying to do. Anchor is a creator-first platform. I'm not going to get into any toe-to-toe with anybody going over terms of service because, quite frankly, I'm not a lawyer. But being a user on the platform, I have not seen any indication that Anchor would take your content and use it for their own gain, or that they would let another user take your content so that they could profit off of it on Anchor. So those that are worried or concerned about that, clearly there's so many other options out here of hosts for you to use. And I've used multiple hosts and I have lots of tutorials. I've got tutorials on how to use Libsyn. I've got tutorials on how to use Podbean. I've got tutorials on how to use Spreaker and how to add those nasty little ads, even though I only did it just for demonstration purposes. And the thing that I love about Anchor is that it's giving you the opportunity to flex your podcasting muscles, to decide if podcasting is right for you. And it's also providing a way for you to build your audience. And yes, you can take that audience to another platform, and Anchor will help facilitate that. I've seen too many people that have done just that, and it's worked smoothly for them. They have to email Anchor, but Anchor support is perfectly fine with someone who wants to migrate to another platform. So I want to dispel those 5 myths, and I hope that you've now got a better understanding of the Anchor platform, how it works, and how it's changing the podcasting space. So I'm here to take any of your calls. If you want to contact me, you can go over to Ileane.link/contact. That's ILEANE.link/contact. That's if you want to send me an email. If you want to send me a voicemail and you're not on Anchor or you don't want to use the Anchor app, then you would go to Ileane.link/voicemail. And remember, you can support the show at Ileane.link/support. Thanks so much, guys. I will talk to you in the next episode. Peace.